Welcome to my story time by mybooksummary.com. Get ready for quick wisdom of countless stories and explore. The Iraq War, 2003 to 2011, also known as the Second Gulf War, was one of the most controversial conflicts of the early 21st century, reshaping the Middle East and the global balance of power. The war began with a US-led invasion that ousted Saddam Hussein from power and sparked a lengthy and tumultuous occupation. The consequences of the Iraq War were far-reaching, as it led to instability, regional tensions, and the emergence of extremist groups that would affect global security for years to come. Introduction: The Road to War. The Iraq War, like many conflicts, did not have a single cause. It was the result of a combination of factors, including the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the desire to combat weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and long-standing tensions between the United States and the regime of Saddam Hussein. The war was framed as part of the broader War on Terror, but it quickly became clear that the justifications for war were more complex than originally presented. 1. The legacy of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein had ruled Iraq with an iron fist for more than 2 decades, and by the time the 2000s arrived, his regime was widely viewed as a destabilizing force in the region. The U.S. government, led by President George W. Bush, had been critical of Saddam for years, particularly for his use of chemical weapons during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s and his brutal suppression of Kurdish and Shiite uprisings in the 1990s. Iraq's refusal to fully comply with United Nations, UN, weapons inspections in the 1990s had left the question of WMDs lingering. The aftermath of the Gulf War, 1990 to 1991, had already left Iraq severely weakened, with a crippling sanctions regime and an inability to develop its military capabilities. Yet Saddam Hussein remained in power, defying UN resolutions and continuing to build his political and military machine despite international condemnation. While the US and many of its allies saw Saddam as a dangerous leader, the question remained: was he actively developing WMDs that could threaten the West? The build-up to the invasion. 1. The War on Terror and the 9/11 attacks. The 9/11 attacks in 2001 marked a turning point in U.S. foreign policy. The attacks, carried out by the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, prompted President George W. Bush and his administration to declare a war on terror. The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 aimed to dismantle the Al-Qaeda network and remove the Taliban from power. However, in the aftermath of 9/11, a broader strategy for combating terrorism began to take shape. This included focusing on Iraq, which was seen as a potential threat due to its regime's ties to terrorism, its history of defying international resolutions, and the belief that Saddam could be developing WMDs. The Bush administration's rhetoric evolved to include claims that Saddam Hussein might be involved in supporting terrorism, including possible links to Al-Qaeda, and that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction. While some intelligence reports suggested links between Iraq and terrorist organizations, others questioned the extent of Saddam's involvement with groups like Al-Qaeda. Nevertheless, the U.S. government used these concerns to build a case for war, while simultaneously emphasizing the need to disarm Iraq of any WMDs it might possess. 2. The United Nations and diplomacy. As the U.S. government moved closer to war, it sought international support. In late 2002, the U.S. pushed for a new UN Security Council resolution to authorize the use of force against Iraq. UN weapons inspectors, led by Hans Blix, were sent to Iraq to search for any evidence of WMDs. Despite inspections that revealed no concrete proof of WMD production, President Bush and his allies, including the United Kingdom's Tony Blair, argued that Iraq's lack of cooperation and continued defiance of UN mandates justified military intervention. However, not all UN members were on board with the war. France, Germany, and Russia were vocal in their opposition, arguing that the UN inspection process should be given more time and that diplomacy, not military action, should be the first course of action. In early 2003, the US and the UK decided to move ahead with military action regardless of the lack of a new UN mandate, leading to widespread international controversy and division. 2. The invasion of Iraq. 1. The initial assault, shock and awe. On March 20, 2003, the US-led coalition began the invasion of Iraq, with the aim of toppling Saddam Hussein's regime and eliminating any potential WMDs. The invasion, named Operation Iraqi Freedom, was preceded by a massive air bombardment campaign known as Shock and Awe, which aimed to quickly overwhelm Iraq's military forces and demoralize the civilian population. The speed and scale of the invasion were remarkable. American and British forces, supported by troops from Australia, Poland, and other countries, quickly overwhelmed Iraqi defenses. Baghdad fell on April 9, 2003, marking the symbolic end of Saddam Hussein's regime. The fall of Baghdad, however, did not end the conflict. In fact, it marked the beginning of a new and more complex phase of the war, the occupation of Iraq. 2. The fall of Saddam Hussein and the aftermath. Saddam Hussein's capture on December 13, 2003, was a defining moment of the war. He was found hiding in a small underground bunker near his hometown of Tikrit, and his capture was widely celebrated in the West as a sign of victory. Saddam was later tried and executed by the Iraqi government, but his removal did not bring the peace or stability that the US and its allies had hoped for. The post-invasion period was marked by widespread chaos. Iraq's political system collapsed, and the US-led occupation forces struggled to maintain control. The absence of a clear plan for the post-Saddam era led to a power vacuum, which was quickly filled by sectarian violence, insurgencies, and the rise of extremist groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, which would later evolve into ISIS. The conflict soon turned into a brutal insurgency, with Iraqi militias and foreign fighters mounting attacks against US forces and their allies. The US military was forced to fight a guerrilla war against well-organized insurgents, and civilian casualties mounted. The war also sparked sectarian violence between Sunni and Shiite factions, further destabilizing the country. 3. The surge and the struggle for stability. 1. The surge strategy. By 2006, the situation in Iraq had deteriorated to the point where the Bush administration had to reconsider its strategy. Public opinion in the US had turned sharply against the war, and political pressure was mounting. In 2007, President Bush announced a new strategy, known as the Surge, which involved sending additional troops to Iraq to help stabilize the country. The surge was controversial but ultimately effective. US forces, under the command of General David Petraeus, increased their presence in key areas like Baghdad and Al-Anbar province. The surge also involved working more closely with local tribes and militias, including Sunni groups that had previously been hostile to US forces. The increased troop presence helped reduce violence in many areas, although the overall security situation remained fragile. 2. The rise of sectarianism and extremism. Despite the success of the surge in reducing violence, Iraq remained a deeply divided country. The US occupation had inadvertently empowered Shiite factions, which were in the majority, and sidelined Sunnis, who had previously been in power under Saddam Hussein's regime. This imbalance fueled sectarian violence and led to the marginalization of Sunni communities, creating fertile ground for insurgents and extremist groups. The most significant of these groups was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had been building strength since the early days of the invasion. Over time, AQI morphed into the Islamic State in Iraq, ISI, and later the Islamic State, ISIS, a brutal terrorist group that would go on to wage war across the Middle East and beyond. 4. The withdrawal and legacy. 1. The U.S. withdrawal. In 2009, President Barack Obama took office and committed to withdrawing U.S. troops from Iraq. By December 2011, U.S. forces had officially left the country, marking the end of the Iraq War in terms of American military involvement. While the withdrawal was seen as a political victory, it also left Iraq vulnerable to further instability. Iraq's fledgling government struggled to maintain control as sectarian violence resurfaced, and the U.S. withdrawal left a vacuum of power that would be filled by the very extremists the war had tried to eliminate. The rise of ISIS in the aftermath of the withdrawal was a stark reminder of the challenges Iraq faced. 2. The legacy of the Iraq War. The Iraq War left behind a country in ruins. Tens of thousands of Iraqis lost their lives, and millions were displaced from their homes. The war cost the United States trillions of dollars and resulted in the loss of over 4,400 American lives. The decision to invade Iraq remains deeply controversial, with many arguing that the war destabilized the entire region and created conditions that allowed groups like ISIS to thrive. The Iraq War also led to significant shifts in U.S. foreign policy. The failure to find WMDs, the lack of a clear post-war plan, and the rise of extremism in the Middle East left many questioning the legitimacy and effectiveness of military interventions in the region. The Iraq War would have a lasting impact on the way the world viewed the United States, as well as the future of conflicts in the Middle East. Final thoughts: the cost of war. The Iraq War was a deeply complex and costly conflict. It was a war that began with the goal of eliminating WMDs and toppling a brutal dictator, but it ended with a fractured Iraq, a re-emerging extremist threat, and a strained international reputation. The war highlighted the unpredictability of military intervention and the profound consequences it can have on both the people involved and the global community. In the end, the Iraq War serves as a reminder of the limits of military power and the challenges of building peace in a region plagued by centuries-old sectarian tensions. As the Middle East continues to grapple with the aftermath of the war, the Iraq War will remain a somber chapter in the history of modern conflict. Stay tuned for more enlightening content. Head over to www.mybooksummary.com. Don't forget to subscribe and share the magic with friends, and let's grow together through the power of books and interesting stories.